In World War II, the average age of the combat soldier was 26. In Vietnam, he was just 19. For today's lecture, we're going to talk about the Vietnam War. Not only the history of Vietnam and the forces that led to the start of American involvement in the Vietnam War, but how soldiers experienced the Vietnam War, and how the war's representation in popular media presented to American people on the nightly news all the way back home in the States could either reflect or cover up those lived realities. The statistic I just gave you first appeared in a documentary TV series. It's called Vietnam, A Television History. And since its initial release in 1983, the claims made in the documentary have contributed to substantial historical debate about how we remember the war in Vietnam. How do we calculate numbers in the statistics, for example? Or if two people give conflicting accounts, whose account do we give greater credit to? Now, specifically, critics of this series pointed out, for example, that although the statistic of the average combat soldier in World War II being age 26 was likely correct, the figures behind such a calculation for soldiers in Vietnam were less reliable. Now, historians who are advocates of America's positive legacy in Vietnam claim that if a documentary like this could lead people to believe that America was sending soldiers so young into combat in such a hostile environment, then surely America's credibility would be damaged. Would the public, going forward, support US involvement in future wars if statistics like these were accepted and propagated as historical facts? Pointing to the average ages of soldiers in combat in different combat units recorded across the conflict and matched up with different ages of soldiers killed in combat, these critics were able to provide numbers which they argued were more dependable. They arrived at the conclusion that the average age of the combat soldier in Vietnam was closer to 22 or 23, with 21 maybe being the absolute lowest age. One couldn't join the armed forces until they were 17, and even then, someone joining at 17 usually wouldn't see deployment until they were 18 years of age. And with so many older men serving in positions of command, the military brass, how could the average feasibly be so low to sit at 19? Well, I would be remiss if I didn't discuss the gentleman whose pictures you see here. His name is Dan Bullock, and when Dan was just 14 years old, he went down to a Marine Corps recruiting office near where he lived in New York City. And after he lied about his age, he successfully enlisted to fight in Vietnam. The next year, when Dan was just 15 years old, he was killed in Vietnam's Quang Nam province, becoming the youngest verified American to have been killed in the conflict. You may be wondering why I'm discussing Daniel Bullock when we talk about calculating averages and other numbers for participants in war. Well, if you were to base your understanding of the Vietnam War off of institutional records only, right, the kind that critics of this 19 number will often cite when they dispute it. If you were to base your understanding of Vietnam War off these records only, you would never know about Dan. Remember, he, like many other Americans who wanted to fight in Vietnam, wanted to fight against this global communist threat, needed to lie about his age to enlist in the armed forces. So just because the Marine Corps records say he was 18 when he was deployed to Vietnam, doesn't make that fact so. He was 14, and when he died, he was 15. That is the real objective truth. But as it turns out, how we remember things, what we present as truth when we talk about history can sometimes be far more nuanced and harder to arrive at and agree upon. So, with all of these different complicating factors, was the age of the combat soldier in Vietnam really 19? I'll be honest with you, I don't know, right? Maybe it was a number like 20 or 21 or even 23, like some of these critics of the 19 number claim. Maybe that's more accurate. I think what the real takeaway here, though, is And what I hope is going to be the largest takeaway from this lecture is that if we want to truly understand the nature and history of something, we need to be willing to ask questions of those who would seek to give us authoritative answers. What really was the average age of the combat soldier serving in Vietnam? Why was America involved in Vietnam for as long as it was? Were American soldiers truly on the verge of victory in Vietnam, as a lot of government and military planners claimed? And if the Viet Cong really were successful in South Vietnam, would other nations fall like dominoes until the US was ultimately forced to fight communists in the very streets of Washington? But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves, right? Like I mentioned, today's lecture is titled War and Peace, the History, Media Representation, and Reality of American Involvement in Vietnam. And per the usual, I'd like to start things off with a quote. This one is by a Vietnamese man who, at least at the time he said this, went by the name of Nguyen Sinh Cung. And he says, "There is nothing more precious than independence and freedom." Nguyen Sinh Cung was a Vietnamese guerrilla fighter during World War II who, as part of a wider anti-fascist Grand Alliance against the Axis, led a hit-and-run campaign against the Japanese occupation of his native country. By 1945, Nguyen Sinh Cung's guerrilla army had taken over much of the Vietnamese countryside, and after the Japanese formally surrendered to the Allies, this army moved into the city of Hanoi, where Nguyen Sinh Cung addressed crowds gathered at the city's central Ba Dien Square. Under his more widely known alias, Ho Chi Minh, the aging guerrilla leader proclaimed Vietnam's independence. The French Empire, however, another ally that had fought against the Nazis, rejected this declaration. Vietnam had been one of France's many colonial possessions throughout the war, and with the war settled, the French government had no intention of letting those colonies go without a fight. So let's take a second to remember what's been happening in some of our previous lectures and readings, right? Some background context, catch us back up to speed. After World War II, China sees a communist revolution that topples the formerly pro-US government of Chiang Kai-shek. In its place, the communist-led government on the mainland seems to begin spreading communism to other countries whenever it can. China officially annexes Tibet during this period, and it fights alongside North Korea against the United Nations in the Korean War. The US government, meanwhile, is getting more and more worried about the spread of communism and tries using two different policies to confront it: containment and rollback. There are two others we're going to mention later on in the lecture I wanted to remind you, but for now let's focus on these two. These policies were met with mixed success, depending on where they were tried. Containment, which prevents communism from spreading to countries that it isn't already active in, was successful in Greece and Turkey, right? Communism does not spread to Greece and Turkey, but it did little to help the Hungarian people when they rose up against the Soviet Union in the 1950s. Rollback, by contrast, is this idea of pushing against communism, actively trying to roll it back from the territories it has spread to. And while rollback prevented countries like Iran and Guatemala from adopting socialist planned economies, it also increased tensions to the point where nuclear war seemed entirely likely, like situations in Korea and Cuba, right? In Korea, you have MacArthur wanting to drop atomic bombs on China and invade from Taiwan. And in Cuba, you have the Bay of Pigs and the famous Cuban Missile Crisis. While both the United States and the Soviet Union are opposed to colonialism at the end of the war, American leaders end up siding with the heads of a lot of European empires, who themselves argue that in order to economically recover from all the destruction and loss that comes out of the war, they need to continue to extract the wealth from their colonies, right? For France, this means maintaining control of lucrative colonies like Algeria and Indochina, right? The idea being, if we can't be profitable enough to keep our people, supplied with the comforts that they're used to, surely they're going to vote for the socialists. So we need to keep these colonies. And in the short-term strategy, America says, all right, that makes sense. All of this is going to contextualize Vietnam. In today's class, we're going to address 4 main topics: French Indochina and Vietnamese independence, American involvement in Vietnam and the domino theory, guerrilla war in the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and then we're going to wrap things up with 1968, kind of the midpoint of the Vietnam War for America, when we talk about the Tet Offensive and its effects on popular opinion. First, let's talk about French Indochina. So we've already alluded to this somewhat, right? But long before World War II occurs, and even before World War I for that matter, the country of Vietnam was an independent monarchy ruled by an imperial family known as the Nguyen dynasty. Now, despite being nominally independent, Vietnam wasn't completely free. Rather, it was something that historians will often refer to as a tributary state, basically meaning that as a smaller country, it had to pay taxes and dues to appease its more powerful neighbor to the north, the Qing Empire in China. It might be a little much to call Vietnam a satellite state of China during this time. A satellite state is kind of the way historians will characterize the relationship between the Soviet Union and its, quote unquote, friendly socialist neighbors in Eastern Europe. But there was, and still is, a bit of historical animosity between Vietnam and China because of this disparity in power in their relationships. Now, the rulers of the Nguyen dynasty were in contact with countries in Europe, which had all been exploring more and more around the world at the time. By the mid-1800s, by the time the mid-1800s come around, the power and influence of China was declining. This was largely because Europe began to rise as an industrial power, while China's economy remained largely stagnant. Changes in both politics and government lead the Nguyen dynasty, because of this, to take a more hostile stance toward foreigners, specifically French and French missionaries who had been coming into the area in greater numbers. The French Empire seizes upon these changes as an opportunity to expand their own colonial possessions. Beginning in 1858 and going on until 1887, France waged a campaign of gradual colonization, slowly chipping away and annexing different territories across Southeast Asia until the entire area was under their control. The French called this region in Southeast Asia that they move into French Indochina, because it sits kind of between India and China, and more importantly, because France owned it. It's worth mentioning here that French Indochina was made up of more than just Vietnam. It also included other contemporary countries like Laos and Cambodia as well. Now, under French administration, industry in Vietnam was quickly built up, but this was done in order to take advantage of the country's natural resources. This relationship is relatively common for colonized countries, where the colonizer primarily will build up methods of resource extraction for industrial profit, but they'll leave the rest of the country as destitute as possible. When a lot of colonized countries start to win their independence in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, they have to do things like completely rebuild their railroad networks, because when the Europeans were in charge, although they built railways, these railroads primarily would link mines and other industrial centers in the interior part of a country to the coast, where all of these things could be shipped out and sent back to Europe. Few, if any, railways built by Europeans were ever actually designed to move people around, right? You didn't have railway networks connecting cities. It was all economic extraction. In World War I, Vietnamese subjects were also used by the French to fight not only in Europe against the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, but they were also put to work in building up other overseas possessions that were controlled by the empire. During this time, many Vietnamese nationals were exposed to different cultures and modes of thinking that had began to spread all around the world. One of these Vietnamese nationals who travels the world during the World War I period is Winston Kong. And while he's in Paris, he gets involved with the French socialists, right? There are socialists in France at the time. Even though they're a colonial power, they are a political force. Now, while all of this is going on, there are insurrections and mutinies against the colonial government in Vietnam. The French suppress these brutally, though, and this adds to existing animosity that persists between the native Vietnamese and the colonizing French. Winston Kong is critical of colonialism as a practice, a view that runs counter to a lot of the prominent French socialists that he had gotten involved with at this time. So he eventually leaves the French socialists and joins up with the French communists, an altogether more radical group, but for all of its faults, it takes a much harder stance against colonial exploitation. Now, following World War I, Winston Kong travels to Paris to take part in the post-war peace talks. Now, we haven't been able to talk about it in this class at all, but if you remember in pre-World War II American history, during this time, US President Wilson pushes out a 14-point agreement, basically to make peace in Europe. And one of these points calls for the self-determination of Europe's colonies. Winston Kong tries to convince delegates at Paris to hear him out and support a bid for the independence of Vietnam based on this 14-point agreement. Winston Kong is ultimately unsuccessful here, but he continues to travel and lobby for Vietnam's right to govern itself. It's during this time that World War II breaks out, and once France is defeated by invading Germans, the Japanese Empire takes advantage of the opportunity to grow their own power by invading France's undefended colonies in Southeast Asia. So Winston Kong adopts this name, Ho Chi Minh, and forms a guerrilla group, which is dedicated to both defeating the Japanese occupation and restoring Vietnam's independence from foreign control. Ho Chi Minh calls them the Viet Minh, and his guerrillas also pledge to kick out French colonizers, kick the French out of the country if they should eventually return after a Japanese defeat. Now, the end of World War II brings us back to this quote by Ho Chi Minh that we had started the lecture with, right? Japanese forces withdraw from Vietnamese territory, conquered during the war, and as they leave cities and towns they used to control, the Viet Minh quickly follow to replace them and begin setting up new governments in the liberated areas of the country. Ho Chi Minh, who described himself as a nationalist first and a communist second, wrote in the new Declaration of Vietnam's independence that, quote, "All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." This immortal statement was made in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America in 1776. In a broader sense, this means all the peoples on the earth are equal from birth. All the peoples have a right to live, to be happy, and free. It's worth mentioning that this isn't just any section of the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence. This is how it starts. Ho Chi Minh would later claim that he included these and other notable axioms of the democratic tradition because he saw striking parallels between the Vietnamese desire for independence from France in the present and the American desire for independence from Great Britain in the past. Despite this flowery rhetoric, though, the Viet Minh began purging rival parties in Vietnam's government after they attempt a coup, and at the same time, the Viet Minh-dominated government began adopting a lot of the same socialist-style land reforms that the U.S. was worried about taking place in other countries, right? In Guatemala, the government there starts land redistribution, so the CIA counters with PB success. In Iran, the government tries to appropriate oil wells, and so Operation Ajax gets Mohammad Mossadegh out of power. Sometimes there's this argument that Ho Chi Minh, Winston Kong, includes the Declaration of Independence of the United States in Vietnam's declaration because he wants to prevent America from getting similarly involved in Vietnam. Kind of like a realpolitik, ends justify the means approach to diplomacy. Other historians are less critical, and they think that because of Winston Kung's experience with the 14 points after World War I and the legacy of American colonial resistance, that America and Vietnam would be natural allies. This doesn't ultimately happen, though. After Vietnam's declaration of independence, the French petitioned the US to support the reinstatement of their colonial regime in Vietnam, threatening a collapse of the French economy if France isn't able to retain control of its empire. If the economy fell, French leaders like de Gaulle argued, then France would surely succumb to socialism. So American policymakers decide to support a French return to Vietnam in 1946, largely because of these two reasons, right? Fears that France would fall to socialism and anxieties caused by the progressive programs that were being adopted by the Viet Minh. This is in 1945, right? The French Empire and the newly created Democratic Republic of Vietnam were now at war. The French were, at least initially, able to reassert control over much of the major cities in Vietnam. However, the Viet Minh maintained control over much of the Vietnamese countryside. The Viet Minh, although now fighting the French Empire instead of the Japanese Empire, resumed their guerrilla campaign of hit-and-run attacks and ambush to defeat the French. The resulting guerrilla war against France for independence came to be known as the First Indochina War. There will ultimately be three Indochinese wars that collectively begin with a French return to Vietnam in 1946, and they don't completely end until 1999. French involvement in Vietnam in the First Indochina War came to a head in 1954 when, after nearly a decade of guerrilla combat, the Viet Minh were able to surround colonial French troops at their massive inland fortress near a city known as Dien Bien Fu. The French famously believed the fort was untakeable, but were unaware that the Viet Minh had managed to smuggle artillery shells into the surrounding hills overlooking the fort prior to the start of the battle. The ensuing carnage at Dien Bien Phu would prove to be a monumental defeat for the French, who were forced to abandon their colonial aspirations in Southeast Asia after the Viet Minh's victory there. Now, I'm going to include a video about the battle after this slide. If my editing skills aren't up to par, I'm just going to post the link in the video description and on Canvas as well. Please make sure you watch it, because as we talk more about Vietnam, you're going to start seeing similarities with the French experience and the American experience as well. This portion is taken out of a different TV series, which is actually award-winning. It's called The Vietnam War, and it's directed and produced by Ken Burns and Lynn Novick, if you know their work.
In July of 1953, the Korean War ended in a negotiated settlement in a still divided peninsula. American policymakers saw it as proof that communism in Asia could be contained. That fall, the French indicated their willingness to begin talks to end the fighting in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh agreed to meet. But before the negotiators were to convene in Geneva, each side sought to improve its position on the battlefield. General Navarre set up a fortified base in a remote valley in northwestern Vietnam called Dien Bien Phu, where he hoped to lure the Viet Minh into a decisive battle. Navarre was certain that superior French firepower and air support would crush any attack by the Viet Minh. He and his commanders saw no need to worry about the jungle-covered hills that overlooked his 11,000 men dug in on the valley floor. The artillery commander was so confident of victory, he complained, "I have more guns than I need." General Giap saw his chance. We decided to wipe out at all costs the whole enemy force at Dien Bien Fu, he remembered. To do it, he pulled off one of the greatest logistical feats in military history. A feat that would be restaged in propaganda films and celebrated for decades. 250,000 civilian porters, nearly half of them women, moved everything he needed for a siege, from sacks of rice to disassembled artillery pieces, on foot through the jungle. Giap surrounded the valley with 50,000 soldiers and 200 big guns, dug in and camouflaged so well they could not be spotted from the air. On March 13, 1954, Viet Minh artillery on the hillsides began raining down 50 shells a minute on the French troops huddled below. The airstrip was destroyed. The besieged troops could only be reinforced and resupplied by airdrop. The French artillery commander, who had underestimated his enemy, committed suicide.
The airlift of Dien Bien Phu continues. Vital men and supplies for the heroic garrison that has defied the massed Viet Minh onslaughts for over 6 weeks. Today, Dien Bien Phu is a human dam trying to stem the red tide that threatens to engulf Southeast Asia.
So after Dien Bien Phu, the French are forced to negotiate with the Viet Minh at the resulting Geneva Peace Conference. Geneva is in Switzerland in Europe. Other major powers are also in attendance, and through a series of meetings, French Indochina is divided into 4 different independent countries: the Kingdom of Laos, the Kingdom of Cambodia, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, or North Vietnam. This is headed by Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, and a different state of Vietnam, or South Vietnam, is also created, and it's led by prominent business leaders and old colonial administrators left behind after the French finished withdrawing from the country, right? And the idea of partitioning Vietnam is similar to the partitioning of other countries between communist and socialist spheres of influence. A man named Ngo Dinh Diem is put in charge as president of the South. This division, like divisions in other countries, is going to be temporary. At least it's announced that as such, right? Democratic elections are going to be scheduled, and they're going to be held in both North and South Vietnam by 1956, in 2 years. These elections never materialized, though. After similar justifications are given for the continued postponing of elections that were used in Korea, a decade or so earlier, specific instructions on when and how elections were to be conducted were unclear in the Geneva Convention, right? So there's a lot of disagreement over how the elections are going to be conducted. Each side is protesting practices that the other side is saying that they're going to use. The communist North and the capitalist South were largely distrustful of each other, right? And so they never are able to reach a compromise on these elections. In the South, they say the communists are undemocratic, their elections won't be free. In the North, they look at the South and say the capitalist elections can't be free. Money is clouding up politics too much, and they're a puppet of the colonialists. And so these elections never take place. Now, I probably recall that the partition of Vietnam, which again takes place in 1954, comes at the height of the Red Scare in the United States, right? We've talked about this a little bit. And at this time, a lot of American politicians and policymakers are concerned that all of Vietnam might vote for a communist government. This had sort of happened in Czechoslovakia, and it looked like it was going to happen in Korea too. Now, This certainly would mean the new unified government of Vietnam would immediately begin exporting revolution to other areas in Southeast Asia, just like China was doing, right? Just like Korea had tried to do when they wanted to invade South Korea. The idea that communism needed to be contained in Vietnam specifically so that it could not be allowed to spread to neighboring countries in Southeast Asia is known as the domino theory. The essential idea behind the domino theory is that if North Vietnam were to unify with the South as one communist nation, then surely Laos and Cambodia would fall to communism too. If all of Indochina became communist, then so would Thailand, Burma, Malaysia, and the rest of Southeast Asia. From that point, where could be next but Indonesia, the Philippines, India, and Australia? Politicians concerned about the safety and security of South Vietnam commonly use the axiom that we must fight them, the communists, over there so we don't have to fight them here. Oftentimes it was said that if the communists were allowed to take over Saigon, then next America would be fighting them in Washington, D.C. In response to the failure of elections to reunify the country, former Viet Minh fighters in South Vietnam regrouped and created an organization known as the National Liberation Front. This ultimately comes to be known as the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong began operating their own guerrilla war against the newly formed South Vietnamese government, which they viewed as an illegitimate puppet of foreign enemies, namely France and the United States, which is now firmly in support, had been firmly in support of French colonialism. It's much in the same way that the Viet Minh had viewed the French and Japanese, and even the Imperial Chinese before them. To the Viet Minh and Viet Cong, there was, quote, nothing more precious than independence and freedom. So this new second guerrilla war starts. And as it begins to drag on, the government in South Vietnam is becoming increasingly unstable. This was caused by a number of factors, right? In part, religious favoritism towards Vietnam's Catholic minority by the South Vietnamese government alienated the country's largely Buddhist population. South Vietnam's president Ngo Dinh Diem was a Catholic, and he treated other Catholics with a lot greater consideration and exception than the majority of Vietnamese who were Buddhist. And this really upset a lot of Vietnamese people. Ngo Dinh Diem, kind of like the leader of South Korea, was a president, but his authority did not have as many checks and balances as you might expect a democracy to have. So while South Vietnam was not a totalitarian state like the People's Republic of China or the Soviet Union, calling it a democracy would be a mischaracterization, at least. Now, religious strife and favoritism weren't the only issues that the Viet Cong were able to capitalize on while they were fighting the government, right? There were also issues of rural and urban poverty, and they were both prominent issues for the country, right? World War II was a world war, and just like France and Western Europe had to rebuild, a lot of countries in the global South, like Vietnam, were facing similar economic constraints. Now, the communist government in North Vietnam was able to take decisive action to provide for the people's needs. The government in the South needed to take the desires and needs of business into consideration as well, though, right? And this is often a theme in the immediate post-war era of the Cold War. Communists are far more dictatorial, they're far more politically repressive, at least as they're presented in the American media. You know, whether or not the communists in North Korea were as dictatorial as Syngman Rhee was in the South is a question that can be up to the debate of the historians. But in comparison to the United States, the communists were not very politically pluralistic. Despite these shortcomings, though, because of all the power the communists have, they're able to easily step into a situation and say, these people need food, there's bread over here, we're just going to take this bread and move it to this group of people that needs it, and the problem is solved, right? The exchange of money, property rights, individual freedoms, these things don't get in the way of economic necessity. This is not true in the South, right? When people own their own shops, when people own natural resources instead of them being owned in common through the government, this means moving things around, moving resources, money, and material around to where it needs to go does not happen so easily or effortlessly. So as time goes on, people look at the situation in South Vietnam and they say there's not serious progress in the situation, right? Many people who are excluded from positions of power begin to view the government as ineffective, corrupt, or simply uncaring, right? That favoritism shows through extra hard here when, as a Buddhist, you see your Catholic neighbor succeeding, well, you are not. These kinds of popular conceptions only help the Viet Cong in their propaganda war against the government. And this is especially true in the less connected countryside, where a lack of modern infrastructure in a lot of places can serve as an even greater barrier to providing for people's needs. Fearing that the South Vietnamese government would soon collapse, President Ike Eisenhower sends military advisors to the country, just, to help stabilize things. After Kennedy takes over the presidency in 1961, he doubles down on Eisenhower's commitments by extending American involvement in the country. Kennedy would send helicopters and no less than 400 Green Berets to South Vietnam. Ostensibly, he sends these Green Berets to South Vietnam to help train the South Vietnamese army. But he also secretly advises the Green Berets to begin conducting actual military operations directly against the Viet Cong. He, of course, goes in front of the national media and claims this is not the case. Just a continuation of that disparity in what people believe, what they are led to believe, and what is the lived reality. Now, what made the Viet Minh and later Viet Cong's guerrilla strategy so effective was the country's ecology. Hot, humid, the fact that much of the country was covered in tropical and subtropical rainforests meant that Viet Cong guerrillas could easily set up, execute, and retreat from ambushes set against their more powerful opponents, right? And this is true of the Japanese, just as it's true of the French and then the Americans. To deal with this issue, the United States launches something known as Operation Ranch Hand. Operation Ranch Hand was a campaign where the U.S. Air Force began spraying an industrial defoliant over the country's rainforests. Strategists believe that if there was no forest cover to hide in, then the Viet Cong would lose their ability to fight the government, paving the way for an easy pro-American victory. The defoliant the Air Force used was called Agent Orange. It wasn't its actual name, but it got that name for the large identifying orange barrels that the chemical came in. The barrels weren't always orange. Sometimes they were black or some other dark color, and they would just have an orange stripe on them, but the orange was kind of consistent here. And while this chemical, Agent Orange, did destroy thousands of acres of rainforest, clearing up a lot of cover that the Viet Cong would have been able to otherwise hide in, it also came with a variety of negative consequences. As Agent Orange was sprayed over rural areas in South Vietnam, where the Viet Cong were active, the chemical also destroyed the crops of small South Vietnamese farmers, ruining their food sources and livelihoods at the same time. The chemical quickly got into the water supply of many rural communities, and as people continued to drink the water without knowing that Agent Orange was getting into their water supply, they faced a massive uptick in generational birth defects and illnesses, which contributed even more to suffering. Today in Vietnam, in the southern portion of the country, specifically the southern Central Highlands, birth defects and cancers are much higher than the rest of the area. And this is because Agent Orange has stayed in the water table for such a long period of time. This only made the Viet Cong more popular, right? Especially with rural farmers. And after a series of political crises shook the South Vietnamese government in 1963, the United States ends up supporting a military coup against Ngo Dinh Diem. This was done in the belief that a transition away from the unpopular Diem government would help stabilize the country, right? The guy who plays favoritism with his Catholic supporters, who ignores issues of poverty, who's somewhat corrupt, admittedly. Now that he's gone, things will surely improve. The coup has the opposite effect, though. And as more and more Vietnamese see the collapse of Diem's government as proof that the South Vietnam state was illegitimate, the political situation only becomes more chaotic. Over the next 2 years after the coup ousts Diem, 12 different governments would ultimately take control of South Vietnam, each one being replaced by a different military coup. This brings us to late August 1964, when the American destroyer, the USS Maddox, was stationed in the Gulf of Tonkin. The Gulf of Tonkin is a large body of water off the east coast of Vietnam. Right, so the US is sending ships there just to kind of patrol the area. We're not actually fighting anyone, but there's the implication that if anything happens, we can respond quickly, so you better watch yourself, North Vietnam. On the night of August 2nd, the Maddox reported that it had been attacked by the North Vietnamese Navy. While the Navy worked to verify that the attack had indeed taken place, a second attack on the Maddox was reported on the night of August 4th. These two events together would come to be known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The Johnson administration, arguing that the US needed to do something, argued that the US needed to become more involved in Vietnam to prevent communist expansion, used the incident to pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in Congress. The resolution gave President Johnson greater powers as president to call on the armed forces of the United States without needing things like formal declarations of war from Congress in order to do so, right? The argument being that our ships are being attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin. We don't have the luxury of time to wait for a declaration of war from Congress. You may have noticed they move on things slowly sometimes. And so the president needs to act, right? Declaration of war from Congress is no longer needed in order for Johnson to push back against the communist aggression in Vietnam and help defend the South Vietnamese government. Later would come to be known through various information leaks like the Pentagon Papers, the memoirs of Robert McNamara, who was in Johnson's cabinet, and most recently, like various leaked NSA documents, from different sources like WikiLeaks or FOIA requests, that the US government deliberately manipulated and misrepresented material from the Gulf of Tonkin incident in order to justify a war against Vietnam. The attack on the night of August 2nd, it turns out, consisted of a brief exchange of gunfire when the US patrol, allegedly, one side accused the other of entering North Vietnamese waters. The American ship suffered no casualties and emerged, quote, unscathed except for a single bullet hole from a Vietnamese machine gun round, end quote. The night of August 4th, the night that ultimately prompted a response from the US government in the form of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, later turned out to be caused by the improper reading of a radar glitch that led naval personnel to believe a torpedo had been fired on them. There wasn't a torpedo, as it turns out. And to this day, the government of Vietnam claims that they had never launched any attack whatsoever in the Gulf of Tonkin. Now, in response to the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and with the powers of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, President Lyndon B. Johnson, who became president after Kennedy's assassination, announced the beginning of Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive bombing campaign of North Vietnam that would go on for more than 3 years. The bombings were intended to destroy the North Vietnamese economy and prevent the North from funding and resupplying the Viet Cong guerrillas operating in the South. Much of the material damage North Vietnam sustained from the bombings was offset by economic aid from the Soviet Union and China, however, which only served as proof to American politicians that Russian and Chinese communists were coordinating with the Vietnamese in a global concerted effort against the United States and the democratic capitalist system. During Operation Rolling Thunder, some US planes were shot down, and Americans piloting them were taken prisoner. They were subject to torture and forced confessions, and many of these pilots would remain trapped in North Vietnam until well after the war. In 1965, with no headway coming from the air war against the North, Lyndon Johnson ordered American Marines to South Vietnam to help fight against the Viet Cong, officially beginning American ground involvement in the Vietnam War. Many Americans first arriving in Vietnam came under assumptions that the Viet Cong were on the ropes and that the war would soon be over. This narrative was only reinforced by positive news coverage of the conflict, but in actuality, this phase of the war would go on for another 10 years. American involvement in Vietnam and North Vietnam's campaign to unify itself with South Vietnam is the Second Indo-Chinese War. So let's take a second to talk about strategy here. The general strategy the US had in Vietnam was one of counterinsurgency. Because guerrillas would rarely attack the US Army directly, the US tried to draw the Viet Cong into battles, or failing that, they would attack remote strongholds the Viet Cong held in the mountains and rural areas of the country. Sometimes referred to as search and destroy missions, these encounters were difficult for US servicemen, as they rarely knew a battle was about to take place until they were actively being fired upon. And when shooting back at the Viet Cong, it could become incredibly difficult to discern who was a member of the guerrillas and who was just a civilian. For quick and effective movement, the US relied heavily on the use of helicopters to ferry soldiers in and out of combat zones. While helicopters were used in previous wars, like in Korea, they were used widely for the first time in Vietnam. Some have referred to Vietnam as America's first helicopter war because of this. While the widespread use of helicopters meant that servicemen could get to combat quicker and more easily, it also meant that the average soldier, in addition to being younger, right? He's not 26, even if it's 23, that's still younger, but 19 is another one of these figures, remember. The average soldier, in addition to being younger, also spent much more time than any of their predecessors had in military engagements. For example, the average infantryman in the South Pacific during World War II saw about 40 days of combat over a span of 4 years. That's 10 days a year, right? The average infantryman in Vietnam saw about 240 days of combat in 1 year. And this is thanks to the mobility afforded by the helicopter. In addition to the methods employed by the army to find the Viet Cong, the tactics of the Viet Cong themselves could prove exhaustive for American troops who were serving in the country. Hit and run attacks were common, and the Viet Cong became skilled at using psychological warfare to wear down US morale. Now, I mentioned that series, The Vietnam War by Ken Burns and Novick. I definitely suggest that you watch it. It is way too long for our class, for our purposes. 10 episodes, each episode about 2 hours apiece. You could really furnish an entire class on just the Vietnam War with some of the material they present. But the series is also rife with these very interesting stories that are relayed from veterans on both sides of the war, right? One of the tactics the Viet Cong would use was they would surround an American encampment, an American base, and they would shoot into the camp from the tree line. This, of course, would wake up all the soldiers in the camp. They would get to their posts. They would fire back into the tree line, the jungle that surrounded them. But the Viet Cong had already left, right? They shoot a bunch and then they retreat. And once the Americans are up and firing back, they're gone. The Americans would stay up a couple of hours through the night. Things had quieted down. They would go to return to bed, and that's when the Viet Cong would come back. They would fire into the camp again. And this would keep American soldiers at this camp, right, staying up through the night for multiple nights at a time. This could wear down morale very quickly. The Viet Cong were also well known for leaving behind varieties of booby traps, which, if not recognized in time, could kill and maim US soldiers. Some examples of the trap left behind by the Viet Cong include punji stakes or punji pits, which you see in the right image there. Very fine, sharpened pieces of bamboo that are stuck into a pit in the ground. That pit is very loosely covered up by foliage. Sometimes the punji pits are actually, the stakes are covered in excrement or other waste. And so when a serviceman is marching on patrol, if they don't see this loose covering in time, their foot would go through the pit, and they would, if not dying from infection and wounds, would be taken out of battle, perhaps permanently, depending on how bad the injury was. You also have tiger traps and deadfalls, which you see there at the bottom, basically rigged flails and percussion objects that would be hidden in the tree, would be hidden around trees with springs loaded in them. So when a trap was set, these things would fly down into the platoon moving through the area below, easily killing or maiming soldiers. You also have two-step Charlies. These are snakes that would be left behind in weapons caches that US servicemen would find on search and destroy missions. They would go to open up backpacks, they would go to open up supply crates, and would find snakes that had been left in there for several days, and so they're incredibly hungry. They're going to strike at the first thing they see. And their venom was deadly, right? They were called two-step Charlies because a Charlie is a code name that was given to the communist enemies. The venom of these snakes would kill soldiers after they took 2 steps, right? A little bit of an exaggeration, but you get the message. The Viet Cong also relied on a complex networks of tunnels that could be used to provide shelter during daylight hours when the Viet Cong would try to limit their movement, right? Hit and run attacks work best at night. Many of these tunnels, as the war dragged on, became remarkably sophisticated. Major tunnels toward the end of the war could even boast things like electricity and rudimentary field hospitals. American soldiers, when finding these tunnels, would frequently be ordered to go in and clear them out. The people who performed this job were known as tunnel rats. And being a tunnel rat was, I think, one of the most dangerous jobs one could have during the war. I'm not 100% if this is the quantitative fact, but I'm pretty sure if it's not the most dangerous, it is easily in the top 5. Some historians estimate the casualty rates of tunnel rats as high as 33%. That means if you're assigned to be a tunnel rat, right, if you're one of these American GIs who's short, kind of slender, enough to get into these tunnels, if you're assigned that duty, you have a 1 in 3 chance of being killed before you make it home. All throughout the guerrilla war in Vietnam, the Viet Cong were able to keep themselves supplied because of a network of pathways that stretched through the mountains of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. This was colloquially referred to as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Now, starting with the dispersal of Agent Orange and the start of Operation Rolling Thunder, the trail remained a major target for US bombers. US military planners believed that if the trail could be shut down, the Viet Cong would run out of supplies and they would be forced to sue for peace, right? Suddenly you're not getting bullets anymore. Suddenly you're not getting the comforts that are produced at home. You're not getting clothing. You're not getting food. You can't keep fighting the army. Of course, you're going to have to surrender, right? Recognizing how vital the trail was to their operations, though, the Viet Cong would maintain entire divisions dedicated to just maintaining the trail, working on road and bridge repair to keep supplies moving southward after American bombs hit. Some members of the Viet Cong, recording their memories after the end of the war, recall constantly rebuilding visible bridges that spanned across deep ravines. These bridges would not survive long because very quickly they'd be spotted by American bombers, and after they were inevitably destroyed in the latest round of bombing runs, these repair teams would set about rebuilding the same bridge. All the while they were doing this, though, trucks and caravans would be crossing a different hidden bridge a mile or two downstream. This, again, is one of these anecdotes that comes up in the Vietnam War series. It should also be mentioned that during this entire guerrilla war, troops had to endure entirely different challenges in addition to fighting to survive on the front lines. Complicating many Americans' experiences in Vietnam and plaguing the military's effectiveness were issues of racism and racial discrimination. Racial barriers prevented many soldiers from cooperating with one another and could even lead to open fighting. The climate posed other challenges to U.S. servicemen too. Vietnam, again, has a tropical environment, and many Americans struggled to become acclimated to the heat and humidity of the country. Additionally, many Americans struggled to familiarize themselves with the native plants and animal life. It was not always readily apparent what plants and animals were poisonous and how they could be avoided. Right? So it's not just enough that as a U.S. serviceman, as a GI in Vietnam, that you are under the constant harassment of hit and run attacks, right? That you're being shot at as you're going on these patrols, these search and destroy missions. You also have to constantly be aware where you're putting your foot, what's hanging overhead, if there's a snake that's tied to a vine as you're moving around a corner, right? There's also the problem of psychological warfare. There's the problem of the climate. A lot of Americans come to Vietnam not knowing how much it rains. They might not have enough socks to keep their feet dry. When you march 10 or 20 miles a day in mountainous terrain with wet feet, you get pretty bad blisters pretty quick. You get something called trench foot. That, again, we haven't been able to talk about World War I, but that becomes an ailment that is common in the times. And then on top of all of these other challenges, there were divisions of race. There was racial animosities among the troops. So the soldiers that you were fighting with, that you were supposed to be dependent on, you couldn't always be sure would have your back. Now, as time went on, the list of casualties mounted from the war, and many Americans began to grow impatient with what they saw as an inability of the U.S. to win the war. This is by 1968. Recall that in 1965, Johnson has sent Marines to Vietnam, very steadily has increased troops. So the U.S. has been fighting in Vietnam for 3 years now directly, but has been more or less involved since 1945, visibly at the very least since 1960, when JFK was president. And so far, the South Vietnamese government is still fighting this insurgency. And not only are they still fighting the insurgency, but the guerrillas seem to be getting stronger, right? Every night, Americans are coming home, they're turning on the television, and they're seeing more and more battles taking place. Part of this idea, right, that America wasn't winning the war stems from the fact that because the US was fighting a guerrilla war, towns and villages might change hands several times. While Americans saw the army struggling to hold villages and territory, the military was using a different set of calculations on how successful they were in the war. It was based on what became known as the kill ratio, right? Or how many Viet Cong soldiers died for every one American casualty. If the kill ratio was high, that was good because it meant the enemy was taking more victims than taking more casualties than you were. If the kill ratio was lower, that was bad because it meant that you were losing more of your own troops in these engagements with the Viet Cong. So long as the kill ratio was high, the military believed the US could outlast the enemy, and their morale would eventually fail. Once enough of the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers had died, North Vietnam would eventually give up on trying to unify the country, right? If you run out of soldiers, you can't fight a war. It's simple math. Now, following this logic, most Americans continued to support the war, but they did so uneasily, right? Americans were used to conventional war, like in World War I, World War II, and in Korea, where there was a shifting front, and the front line would move either toward or away from the enemy's capital, depending on if you were successful or not successful in fighting them. Guerrilla war isn't like that. By 1967, many Americans, again, while weary of the war and the military draft that was required to keep it going, they still believed when the military and government told them that victory in Vietnam was closer than ever, right? Every day we're getting, because of this kill-death ratio, because of our success on the battlefield, we're getting closer and closer to winning this war. Victory is within our grasp. Now, while many Americans continued to support the war, a substantial anti-war movement had developed in the United States, and it had seen rapid growth through 1966 and 1967. The draft helps with this a lot, right? A lot of young American college-age students graduating high school, they had not fought in World War II or Korea, but when you're drafted to go fight in another country, you might tend to have reservations about that. The draft does not help stymie the anti-war movement. Now, in the beginning of 1968, right, when all of this is going on, the Viet Cong and the South Vietnamese Army begin an informal and temporary truce to celebrate the Vietnamese New Year. This is known as Tet. It takes place kind of late January-ish. Now, while a major battle was raging around the forward base of Khe Sanh, which was held by Marines in the country, Khe Sanh is near the border with North Vietnam, this truce seems to be holding. And the country in general is starting to see a decrease in fighting as they get closer and closer to the Vietnamese New Year, this holiday called Tet. The temporary ceasefire and the fighting at Khe Sanh ultimately turned out to be a diversion, though. In the months leading up to Tet, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese had been building up their forces and supplies all throughout the South. The leader of the North Vietnamese army, a guy named Nguyen Giap, believed that if the Viet Cong attacked the South Vietnamese army and the government all at once with a great show of strength, this very weak and fragile government might just actually break and collapse, right? You just need to put enough pressure on this weakened South Vietnamese government and everything will fall apart like a house of cards. Once this happens, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese believed the US would have to withdraw, right? You can't help prop something up. You can't stabilize something if there's nothing to prop up and stabilize. It'd have to leave South Vietnam. So this plan to just attack everything at once in one great show of strength, right? To take all the cards, was launched in surprise during Tet celebrations throughout South Vietnam. It actually comes to be known as the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive initially destabilized South Vietnam. Many major cities and towns were actually overrun by a joint Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army attacks. And for some time, within the North Vietnamese government, at least, many believed that they were finally bringing the war to a close. It looked like everything was going to plan. South Vietnamese people who were living in areas previously thought safe from attack were murdered by the Viet Cong if it was believed they had been collaborating with the Americans. In the ancient capital of Hue, for example, which is the city that kind of sits in the middle of the country, it used to be the seat of the Imperial Nguyen dynasty. The Viet Cong take over that city and they systematically murder thousands of their political opponents in the brief period, a couple of months that they control the city, right? If you were a clerk for the city government, that meant that you were aiding and abetting this puppet regime. You were an enemy of the people. If your brother was an officer in the South Vietnamese army, you were a traitor to the Vietnamese independence struggle, and so you would be executed. Some members of the Viet Cong, in an attack on the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon, found their way into the actual embassy of the United States. They attacked the American embassy, they made it onto the embassy's grounds, and this shocked many Americans who were watching all of this carnage unfold from home. And not only Americans, but like all over the world, the Tet Offensive, and specifically the attack on the US Embassy in Saigon, had a huge impact on the way the Vietnam War was perceived. Now, strategically, the Tet Offensive actually proved to be a monumental setback for the Viet Cong. Many of the networks in urban and rural areas they had spent years constructing as a part of their guerrilla campaign, right? Like this kind of secret shadow government that operates at night when the American soldiers and troops would leave an area, they'd kind of come out and continue to govern. All of these networks had been exposed, meaning they were no longer usable. And additionally, the Viet Cong lose thousands of soldiers in the offensive, many of whom had invaluable experience in fighting as guerrilla operatives, right? You have veterans who had been, fighting in South Vietnam, in the unification struggle, the liberation struggle. You have, they had been fighting in South Vietnam for 10, 15 years. They gained a lot of field knowledge, a lot of practical knowledge. Fighting in the open, trying to take an entire city is very different from a guerrilla war, and they suffered heavy casualties, not only when they took a lot of these towns, but ultimately when the US and the South Vietnamese government is able to turn around and retake them. They lose even more soldiers. Right? Many of the gains of the Tet Offensive are ultimately rolled back by both South Vietnam and the American Army in the next coming weeks and months. The events in Vietnam, though, aren't just strategy. There is also a political war going on. And the Tet Offensive is a huge political victory for the Viet Cong because it convinces many Americans that the war in Vietnam is unwinnable. Right? A lot of Americans watched the Tet Offensive unfold on the nightly news, and they had been told for several years by the military, the government, by Johnson and his administration, that victory was just around the corner. And then they come home from a long shift at work, they turn on the news after a dinner, and they see that there is fighting in the American embassy in the very heart of South Vietnam itself. Combined with domestic challenges at home, which we're going to be talking about in a couple weeks as well, 1968 and the Tet Offensive proved to be a major tipping point for many Americans who went from patriotically supporting the war to questioning the merits in fighting it, if not directly opposing it and openly calling for American withdrawal. 1968, we'll talk about a little bit later in the semester, really serves as a tipping point nationwide in a lot of ongoing struggles that we're seeing in the post-war order. And the Tet Offensive and the turn in the tide in Vietnam is but one of them. So what are the takeaways, right? What should we remember from this lecture? Well, the United States becomes involved in Vietnam out of a very real desire to stop communist expansion. America doesn't go into Vietnam to set up a new colonial enterprise like the French had done, though there are certainly historians who will characterize South Vietnam as kind of a colonial regime. Many in America wanted America to be involved in the Vietnam conflict to stop communism. The Viet Minh and later the Viet Cong were headed by communists, right? So there's something to give credit to the fact that a lot of Americans believed that the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong were fighting for communist expansion. But for many in Vietnam, their appeal lay primarily in their anti-colonial resistance, right? Nothing is more precious than independence and freedom. That was really what led the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong to gain their popularity. Combat in Vietnam was brutal. The American military and the American people were used to fighting conventional wars, but not these long, drawn out and costly anti-insurgency campaigns. And over time, government promises that the war would soon end fell short. And this really energizes an anti-war movement in the United States that begins to grow as a political force. At the start of the lecture, I said that we should always be questioning the pen to paper excuses or explanations that are provided to us about an issue or a conflict. And this starts to happen in the United States in many ways. Did the Vietnamese, through the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong, really want to sacrifice tens of thousands to millions of lives of their own countrymen to advance the global communist revolution? Or were they fighting for the independence and unification of their country? Which motivation spoke to more Vietnamese, and which motivation spoke more to the US State Department or to the American public at home? Now, we're going to return to Vietnam later on in the semester, right? We're stopping here at 1968 because with the Tet Offensive, with the offensives at Khe Sanh, with everything going on in this year, 1968 proves to be a pretty monumental turning point. And when we come back next week and we talk about this decline of the New Deal coalition and the 1968 presidential election, that's only going to further reinforce how much of a shift and a change 1968 was, not only for the war in Vietnam, but for America in general even. And so all of these things that are going on, the anti-war movement, the war in Vietnam, presidential politics, they are incredibly important to a lot of themes and discussions we're having this semester. And so if we tried to talk about the entirety of the Vietnam War in just one lecture, we would be doing a disservice to how important this conflict was and how damaging it was to people, not only in the United States or Vietnam, but around the entire world. So keep that in mind, right? The United States is not going to withdraw from Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, until 1975. That's 7 years after 1968. So we still have quite a lot of ground to cover. But until we get to 1975, though, I want you to start thinking about Vietnam, about how you would react to this kind of news if you were an American living at the time, right? Because a lot of the same things we see going on in Vietnam, you know, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself. It never perfectly rhymes, but it does echo. We see things happening in the past similarly taking place in the now and then in the future, right? They're not exact copies, but themes and trends tend to repeat themselves. And you might, with some more historical understanding and some more historical knowledge, come to realize that a lot of the responses that you have to events today aren't too dissimilar from the ways Americans viewed the world in the past. Keep that in mind. If that kind of discussion is particularly interesting to you, then you'll be happy to know that it is going to form one of the major discussion board prompts, 2 of which you'll be required to respond to by the end of the week, right? If you've already viewed our first lecture on the civil rights movement, the struggle for rights and freedoms, and this battle for over de jure and de facto discrimination, as well as the difference of what that means, then you'll already know, and I'm kind of already like reiterating again, that you'll be expected to respond to 2 of these prompts. Again, there's more than 2, so you can pick which ones appeal to you. And you'll also want to make sure that you reply to some of your classmates, right? Don't be afraid to have some of these discussions to kind of see where other people are approaching issues from, and maybe where you have similarities in your viewpoints, maybe where your viewpoints differ. Always remember just to make sure those conversations are respectful, even if you do disagree. Again, of course, make sure that you are staying on top of the readings. Chapter 2 of These United States, try and have that chapter done by the end of the week. Also try and finish up your autobiography, right? If you're reading Asada, an autobiography, or if you're reading Kovic's Born on the 4th of July, whichever one you're doing, if you're not finishing that by this week, try and have it done by the start of next week. So you're giving yourself ample time to write that kind of mid-semester, midterm book review. Those are not going to be due this Friday on the 28th. They will be due the following Friday, which is June 4th, June 5th, whichever date that is, whichever date Friday next week is. those papers will be due. So making sure you're giving yourself ample time to respond to these books, to really formulate your ideas and kind of analyze and interrogate what's going on in these pieces of literature. Make sure that you're staying on top of those readings so you can do that. And then lastly, of course, if you've missed last week's extra credit opportunity, or even if you took advantage of it and you want to take advantage of this next one, our second extra credit film review will be due at the end of this Friday. This documentary is, it was kind of released in stages, but the ultimate kind of the final version that came out in 1962. It's one of these very kind of quintessentially American public service announcement style documentaries. It's called Red Nightmare, Freedom and You. What happens to America if the Soviets take over, if godless communism usurps the government? How are everyday Americans going to be affected? And how can everyday Americans prevent these things from happening, right? Through civic engagement and political participation. If you do decide to complete this extra credit review, don't be afraid to tell me not only how you feel looking back on this type of film, but how people at the time may have responded to it, right? And that's not just Americans responding to this at the time too. We've just completed this lecture, at least on the first half of American involvement in Southeast Asia, Vietnam specifically, but also wider Southeast Asia. How would people in these countries that are being nominally occupied by American forces, if they saw a documentary like this, how might their viewpoints differ? Don't be afraid to get creative with these reviews, to offer insights that you might not feel are directly on topic, but are still related. Those are always appreciated. Another thing that's always appreciated, of course, is any comments, questions, concerns, or feedback. As your instructor, I want to make sure that everyone is getting the maximum benefit and knowledge and wisdom out of this course that they can, even if it is just required for you. I want to make sure you're walking away from this class gaining something. So don't be afraid to reach out and contact me for really anything at all, right? I am your instructor. Your academic success is my highest interest in this class. So feel free to reach out. You can do that by Canvas Messenger. You can do that over email, however works best for you. But I am available and I will respond as soon as I'm able.